All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling a question about how we should handle evidence that makes us doubt our own thinking.
That's a good one.
Yeah, so this is a concept in philosophy known as higher order evidence.
Right.
And we're going to be looking at how it affects our regular first order beliefs about the world. So just to dive straight in, let's imagine a scenario. Let's say we have a pilot named Aisha, and she's flying to Hawaii,
Okay.
and her instruments, they're all giving her strong evidence. Let's call this E.
Hmm.
And this evidence suggests that she has enough fuel, which we'll call G,
Okay.
to make it to Hawaii. And so she's done the calculations, everything looks good, and so she believes that she has enough fuel.
Yeah, sounds pretty reasonable. I mean, based
Yeah.
on the information she has, she
Yeah.
seems to have good reason to believe this.
Exactly.
But here's where things get a little bit tricky.
Right. So Aisha glances at her altimeter,
Okay.
and she realizes that she's at a very high altitude. And this is putting her at risk of hypoxia. Oh, wow.
And for those who don't know, hypoxia is a condition that basically impairs your reasoning. You don't really feel it happening, but your thinking gets cloudy and it can be dangerous.
Right.
And Aisha knows that pilots in this state who are, trying to do these same fuel calculations, they only get it right about half the time. So now, in addition to E, this evidence about fuel, she has this new piece of information. We'll call this H. So she has E, which is evidence suggesting that she has enough fuel, and now she has H, this evidence that she's at risk of hypoxia.
So H, this new evidence, isn't telling her anything about the fuel levels directly. It's
Yeah.
telling her about her ability to assess
Exactly.
whether she has enough fuel.
Yeah, so H is what philosophers call higher order evidence.
Okay.
It's evidence about her ability to form beliefs about the world, or in this case, about the fuel levels. And so this leads to a question. How should Aya's concern about hypoxia affect her belief about having enough fuel?
Ooh, good question. Yeah. Even though, the fuel gauges haven't changed, she now has this reason to doubt her judgment.
Right?
Should this higher order evidence rationally change her confidence in G, her belief that she has enough fuel?
Yeah, that's a really tricky question because like you said, the fuel gauges haven't changed. So the evidence E still seems to support G,
Right.
but now she has evidence suggesting that her reasoning about E might be unreliable.
Yeah. You could say it's like this tension between evidence pointing to a conclusion and the evidence questioning her ability to reach that conclusion.
Exactly.
And it gets even more complicated if you consider something called epistemic acrasia.
Epistemic acrasia, okay.
This is a fancy term that philosophers use to describe a situation where you hold a belief but also think you shouldn't.
Oh, interesting.
So let's say Aisha decides, you know what, I'm still going to be confident that I have enough fuel. Even though she recognizes that hypoxia might be affecting her thinking, she still maintains high confidence in G that she has enough fuel.
Right.
So in this case, she's in the Socratic state.
Right. Where she's believing something that she kind of judges herself as likely to be wrong about.
That sounds kind of paradoxical, like believing something even though you think you shouldn't.
It's like a weird tension between what you believe and what you think is rational to believe.
Yeah, I can see why that's a problem.
So what we're trying to do today is unpack all of this. We're diving deep into the issue of higher order evidence, and we'll be looking at different perspectives, different ways philosophers have tried to grapple with this issue. So let's start by thinking about, what makes higher order evidence so distinctive? Like what makes it different from regular first order evidence?
Okay, so we've got higher order evidence, evidence about our belief, and first order evidence, evidence about the world. So what makes higher order evidence so special?
Yeah.
Well, it's not about the thing that you believe in itself. It's about the process of forming that belief.
Right.
Like in Aisha's case, it's not telling her anything about the actual fuel levels. It's telling her about whether she can trust her judgment about those levels.
And as you mentioned earlier, it can come from various sources. It could be a dramatic situation like Aisha's with hypoxia, but it can also be more ordinary things like realizing you might be biased about something.
Right.
Or you're feeling really tired and you know that your thinking isn't as sharp when you're tired.
Yeah, definitely.
And even when, someone we trust and respect disagrees with us, that can act as a kind of higher order evidence.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's like when someone you trust disagrees with you, it makes you question your own reasoning.
Yeah, exactly. It's like,
Yeah.
maybe I've overlooked something if they see it differently.
Right, you're forced to take a second look at your own thinking.
Now, it's tempting to think that higher-order evidence just weakens our initial evidence, but it's actually a bit more complex than that. Um, there's a philosopher, Joshua DiPaolo, who points out this difference. He uses this analogy with a red wall. Let's say you see a red wall, and this gives you good reason to believe that the wall is red.
Makes sense.
But then you find out that the wall is actually being illuminated by a red light. This is like regular, what philosophers call undercutting defeat. The red light makes you doubt whether the wall actually looked red in normal lighting.
Right. The red light casts doubt on your initial perception.
Exactly. But with Aisha and the hypoxia, it's different. The hypoxia doesn't just make her doubt the fuel readings, it makes her doubt whether she interpreted those readings correctly in the first place.
So it's not about the evidence itself, it's about her ability to process it.
Exactly. She might wonder if her initial evidence ever really supported G, that she had enough fuel, as strongly as she initially thought. The doubt targets her entire thought process, not just a specific piece of evidence.
Right. The doubt is more global, affecting her confidence in her overall reasoning abilities.
And DiPaolo calls this object-independent defeat, because her hypoxia would affect any belief she formed at that altitude, not just the one about fuel.
So it's not specific to this few situation, it's a general concern about her cognitive state.
Exactly. And another philosopher, David Christensen, adds another layer to this. He says higher-order evidence is also agent relative. So the information about Aisha's potential impairment is crucial for her reasoning, but it wouldn't affect someone on the ground looking at the same fuel data.
Right, because their thinking isn't being affected by hypoxia.
Exactly. Their minds aren't compromised in the same way, so the higher-order evidence wouldn't apply to them in the same way.
So it's specific to Aisha's situation and her mental state.
Now, here's where things get really interesting and maybe a little bit counterintuitive. Some philosophers argue that higher-order evidence might actually obligate us to ignore or set aside some of our initial evidence or reasoning.
Wait, ignore evidence? That sounds a bit odd. Isn't the point to consider all the evidence we have?
It does seem counterintuitive, right? But think about it this way. If Aisha is allowed to say, well, my calculations show I have enough fuel, so I must not be hypoxic, she's using the very reasoning that's in question to dismiss the doubt about that reasoning.
Right, it's circular reasoning. She's using potentially flawed thinking to defend itself.
Exactly. So the idea is that to avoid this kind of circularity, she needs to temporarily bracket or set aside her initial calculations once she has reason to doubt her cognitive state. It's like she can't keep going back to the potentially misinterpreted evidence to defend herself.
So it's about preventing a kind of biased defense of our initial conclusions.
Exactly. And this leads to a concern that some philosophers, like Horowitz and Schoenfield, have raised.
Mhm.
They suggest that if higher-order evidence has a direct impact on our first-order beliefs, it might actually be predictably misleading.
Predictably misleading. So trying to be more rational could actually lead us away from the truth.
That's the worry. They argue that, ideally, rational thinkers using good, solid first-order evidence should get closer to the truth. But if higher-order evidence makes us doubt our ability to use that evidence well, it could lead us astray, even if we're being rational.
So trying to be careful and account for the higher order doubt could actually backfire and push us further from the truth.
That's what they're suggesting. And it's a real head-scratcher because it seems like being more careful about our thinking shouldn't make us less likely to believe true things.
Okay, so we've seen how higher order evidence presents some unique challenges, but some philosophers actually argue that it shouldn't really affect our first order beliefs. What's their rationale?
This is where the work of Maria Lesson-Arnio comes in. She argues that trying to incorporate higher-order evidence can lead to what she calls structural problems. And these problems arise when a rational person is seemingly forced to violate basic principles of good thinking.
So trying to be more rational could actually lead to irrational outcomes. How does that happen?
Well, let's go back to Aisha and her fuel calculations. Let's imagine for a moment that her initial evidence guarantees that she has enough fuel. So there's no possible way that her evidence could be true and she'd be short on fuel. It's completely conclusive. Now, even when she considers the hypoxia risk, this initial conclusive evidence is still part of her total information set.
Right, she hasn't lost that original evidence.
Now, there's a very strong principle in logic that says if your evidence guarantees something is true, then you should believe it. So even with the hypoxia worry, it seems like Aisha should still believe she has enough fuel, because the evidence still logically points to that conclusion. But intuitively, the hypoxia risk also suggests that she should be less confident, maybe even suspend judgment altogether.
So she's being pulled in two different directions. The logic of her evidence says believe G, but the higher order doubt says be less confident.
That's exactly the problem. By trying to be more careful about her reasoning, she ends up in a situation that seems to violate this basic principle of good thinking.
So it's like higher order evidence creates a conflict between different rational requirements.
That's the core of the structural problem. Lasson and Arnio explores different ways to try and resolve this, like making exceptions to these logical rules when higher-order doubt arises. But she argues that these solutions often just lead to more problems down the line, like needing an endless chain of rules about when to apply the exceptions, and so on.
Right, it sounds like a recipe for infinite regress rules about rules.
Her point is that maybe we should just trust the initial logical rules governing our beliefs about the fuel, even when we have these higher-order concerns.
Okay, so we've got this potential for conflict between different principles of good reasoning. Are there any other challenges to taking higher order evidence seriously?
Yeah, there's another big one called the self-undermining objection. This objection points out that if we create principles that tell us to revise our beliefs based on higher-order evidence, those principles themselves might become targets of that very same higher-order doubt.
So, a principle about rationality could actually undermine itself. That's a bit of a mind bender.
Let's say we have a principle called HOD, short for higher-order defeat. And HOD says, if you have higher-order evidence against a belief, you should lower your confidence in it. Pretty straightforward. Now imagine someone, let's call him Sam, who believes that HOD is a correct principle of rationality. But then Sam encounters some higher-order evidence that targets his belief in HOD itself. Maybe he finds out that a group of really smart philosophers he respects all strongly disagree with HOD.
So, according to HAD, Sam should lower his confidence in HOD.
Exactly. The very principle he believes in tells him to doubt it. But then what? If he doubts HOD, does he go back to fully trusting his initial reasoning about other things, even though that reasoning might be flawed? The principle seems to give conflicting advice.
It's almost like a belief that eats itself.
Yeah, it's a tricky situation, and people who think higher-order defeat is important have tried to come up with ways around this. Some have suggested that really fundamental principles like HOD might be immune to this kind of self-undermining. Others have argued that our acceptance of these very basic principles isn't really a belief in the same way we believe other everyday things.
So, it's a different kind of acceptance, not subject to the same kind of doubt.
That's one idea. And yet others have argued that we don't necessarily have to get caught in these endless loops of self-undermining doubt, even if it means accepting some situations where we might hold beliefs we also think we shouldn't.
So, maybe a little bit of epistemic acrasia is unavoidable.
That's a possibility. So even with these responses, the self-undermining worry remains a significant challenge to taking higher-order evidence super seriously.
Okay, so we've seen some strong arguments against giving higher order evidence much weight. What happens if we just say, you know what, it doesn't really matter?
If we downplay the importance of higher-order evidence, there are a couple of main approaches: level splitting and steadfastness. Think of them as different ways of sticking to your guns, philosophically speaking.
Level splitting and steadfastness, they sound like opposing teams in a philosophical debate.
In a way, they are. So level splitters like Lasson and Arnio argue that Aisha, in our example, should maintain her high confidence in having enough fuel based on that initial evidence. Yes, up. But at the same time, she should also doubt her rationality in forming that belief because of the hypoxia risk.
So she's confident in the conclusion, but not in her ability to have reached it correctly. That seems like a recipe for some serious internal conflict.
Yeah, it's a form of what we call rational epistemic acrasia. She believes something while also thinking she might be wrong to believe it. The idea is that it acknowledges both her first-order evidence and the higher-order worry, but it can lead to some strange outcomes. For example, as the philosopher Horowitz points out, if Aisha keeps finding herself in this situation, she could end up using her apparent success, despite the hypoxia, to eventually dismiss the worry about her reasoning altogether, which seems like a problem.
Right. It's like someone who's consistently lucky despite making bad decisions might start to think they're actually good at making decisions.
Exactly. It seems like there should be some negative consequence to repeatedly having beliefs you think you shouldn't have, even if those beliefs happen to be true.
It feels like a recipe for overconfidence and potentially dangerous decisions down the line. Okay, so level splitting has its downsides. What about the steadfasters? What's their approach?
Steadfasters, like Kelly and Smithies, take a more direct route. They argue that Aisha should Essentially, just ignore the higher order evidence about hypoxia and stick with her initial confidence in both having enough fuel and her assessment that her evidence supports that conclusion.
So just completely disregard the possibility of impaired thinking. That seems awfully risky, especially for a pilot responsible for other people's safety.
That's the main criticism of steadfastness. It can seem dogmatic and irresponsible. How can it be rational to simply ignore a serious reason to doubt your cognitive abilities?
It feels like burying your head in the sand and hoping for the best.
Yeah, it definitely goes against the intuition that we should be responsive to evidence that challenges our own thinking.
So it seems like we're stuck between a rock and a hard place. If we take higher order evidence seriously, we risk paradoxes or strange belief states. But if we ignore it, we risk being dogmatic and potentially wrong. Is there any way out of this dilemma?
If we decide that we do want to take higher order evidence seriously, the question becomes how to actually incorporate it into our reasoning without running into all these problems. And this is where we get into different principles that philosophers have proposed.
So, like rules for how to handle these tricky situations.
Exactly. There are independence principles, which tell us what evidence or reasoning we might need to set aside when higher order doubt arises. And then there are level bridging principles, which explain how our higher order beliefs about our thinking should influence our first order beliefs about the world.
Okay, so independence is about what to ignore, and level bridging is about how to connect our beliefs about our minds to our beliefs about the world. Let's start with independence. What's the main idea behind these principles?
The main idea is to prevent the kind of circular reasoning we talked about earlier. We can't use the very reasoning that's being questioned by higher order evidence to dismiss that doubt. We need a way to step outside of that potentially flawed process.
Right, we need some kind of neutral ground from which to evaluate our own thinking. But the idea of ignoring evidence still feels a bit uncomfortable.
Yeah, it's definitely counterintuitive.
Yeah.
And some philosophers, like Kelly, have argued that independence principles might make rationality too easy. If someone makes a complete mess of their reasoning, can they just adjust their confidence based on some general higher order worry and have all their mistakes excused?
It does sound like a loophole for sloppy thinking.
But Christensen responds to this by saying that even if someone adjusts their belief based on higher order evidence,
Mhm.
we can still distinguish their final belief state from someone who reasoned correctly from the start. The person who avoided the error in the first place is still in a better epistemic position.
Right, they've done a better job of forming their beliefs.
Exactly. But even if we accept that we sometimes need to set things aside, what exactly should we set aside? Just the initial evidence, the entire reasoning process, specific parts of that process.
Yeah, it's not immediately clear what gets bracketed.
This is where things get really nuanced. It's not as simple as just saying, ignore everything you initially thought. Often, specific facts about our reasoning, or even particular pieces of evidence, are still relevant for assessing our overall reliability. And completely ignoring them could be irrational in itself. It's more about identifying the specific parts of our thinking that the higher order evidence gives us reason to doubt.
So it's like a surgical strike on our own reasoning, targeting the areas where we have reason to be suspicious.
That's a good way to put it. And there's also the question of how much we might be asked to set aside. If the higher order doubt is very broad, like a general feeling of being unreliable, could it lead to widespread skepticism? What if we start questioning everything we think? Some philosophers think universal doubt is incoherent, but the worry about excessive doubt is still there. Elga, for instance, argues that we probably shouldn't have universal doubt about our moral beliefs because it seems unlikely that we'd have reasons to doubt all of them independently.
So there are limits to how far this setting aside should go.
Yeah, the idea is that we need specific reasons to doubt specific things. And as Vavova and Christensen point out, there's an important difference between revising our beliefs because we lack reason to trust them and revising them because we have positive reason to think we're mistaken. The first can lead to a kind of general skepticism, while the second is more targeted and focused.
So it's better to have concrete reasons for doubt than just a vague feeling of unease. Okay, so independence principles help us figure out what to set aside. Now, how do these level bridging principles help us actually adjust our first order beliefs based on the higher order evidence?
Level bridging principles aim to connect what we believe about the world with what we believe about our ability to form beliefs reliably or rationally. Some focus on aligning our beliefs with what we think is rational to believe, while others focus on calibrating our beliefs to our estimated reliability.
Rationality versus reliability, two different ways to bridge the gap. Let's start with the rationality-focused principles. What's the core idea behind them?
The basic idea is that your beliefs should line up with your best judgment about what it's rational to believe. So if you think it's rational to believe P, then you should believe P. It's like trusting your own assessment of what's rational.
That sounds pretty intuitive. But what if we're unsure about what's rational in a particular situation? Like, Aisha might not be sure if her initial confidence was rational given the hypoxia risk.
Right. One influential idea is the principle of rational reflection. And this principle says that your degree of confidence in a proposition should be the same as your belief that it's rational for you to have that degree of confidence. So it's like your confidence should reflect your belief about how rational that level of confidence is.
So if Aisha thinks there's a 50-50 chance that high confidence was rational and a 50-50 chance that low confidence was rational, rational reflection would suggest she should end up somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, that's the basic idea. It supports the intuition that higher-order doubt should usually lead to a decrease in confidence. But there's a famous problem for rational reflection that comes from a thought experiment called the unmarked clock.
The unmarked clock. Okay, I'm intrigued. What's the scenario?
So imagine someone named Chloe is looking at a clock that only has a minute hand, no numbers. And the hand is pointing somewhere between where the 4 and the 5 would be. She's trying to figure out what the exact minute is.
Right, so she has some visual evidence, but it's not very precise.
Exactly. And intuitively, Chloe shouldn't be certain about any particular minute. Her confidence should be highest for the minutes right around where the hand is pointing, and then gradually decrease as you move further away in either direction. She can figure this out just by thinking about how clocks work and the limitations of her evidence.
Makes sense. She has to distribute her confidence based on the imprecision of the information.
But philosophers like Williamson and Elga have pointed out that this seemingly intuitive way of distributing her confidence actually violates rational reflection. So Chloe, being rational, will have a range of different credences across different possibilities for the time. But for some of those possibilities, her credence in the actual time being closer to the apparent position might be higher than what would be rational if that further away minute were the true time. So she's in a position to know that her credences are potentially misaligned with what she thinks would be rational in those specific scenarios.
It's like her beliefs about what time it is don't perfectly match up with her beliefs about what would be rational if those beliefs were true.
Exactly. And this has led to some proposed modifications to rational reflection, like Elga's new rational reflection. This principle says that you should align your beliefs with the opinion of a hypothetical expert on rationality who has all your first-order evidence and is completely certain that they are an expert. It's a way of trying to accommodate situations where there might be some rational uncertainty about what perfect rationality demands.
So it's a more nuanced way of deferring to your judgment about rationality.
Yeah. In the unmarked clock case, new rational reflection actually allows for this kind of imprecise credence distribution that seems intuitive, even if it doesn't perfectly line up with what would be rational in each individual possible scenario. But both rational reflection and new rational reflection have faced some criticism, like whether we really have enough self-knowledge to apply them consistently and whether we should really be deferring to all possible theories of rationality.
It sounds like finding the right way to connect our beliefs about rationality to our beliefs about the world is still a work in progress. Okay, so those are some of the rationality-focused principles. What about the reliability-focused ones? How do they handle higher-order evidence?
The reliability-focused approaches shift the focus from internal consistency to actually getting things right, to being accurate. The idea is that higher-order evidence matters because it gives us information about how reliable we are at forming certain types of beliefs in certain types of situations. And one of the key principles here is White's calibration rule. It says that your confidence in a proposition should be equal to your prior expectation of how often you'd be right if you held similar beliefs in similar circumstances.
So it's about matching your confidence to your track record.
Exactly. So in Aisha's case, if she knows that pilots in her state are only right about fuel calculations 50% of the time, then her confidence in her own fuel calculation should drop to around 50%, regardless of how strong her initial calculations felt.
So her confidence should reflect her estimated reliability in that kind of situation.
Right. These principles aim to get our confidence levels calibrated to our actual performance, our history of being right or wrong. They don't directly answer the question of what's rational to believe, but they focus on what level of confidence is likely to lead to accurate beliefs.
So they're more pragmatic, focusing on what works.
You could say that. Of course, they also run into the generality problem, which is how do we define similar circumstances for the purpose of assessing reliability.
Right. That seems like a crucial question. How do we group together different situations to figure out how often we're right in those types of situations?
It's a tough one. But one advantage of the reliability-focused approaches is that they often handle cases like the unmarked clock more intuitively than strict rational reflection. They focus on Chloe's likely accuracy in estimating the time, given her limited visual information, without getting too hung up on the specific rationality of each individual credence she assigns. But on the flip side, they might not have as much to say about the internal struggle of epistemic acrasia.
So they're good at handling the external truth tracking aspect, but maybe not as good at addressing the internal conflict of believing something you think you shouldn't.
Yeah, that's a fair assessment. So we have these different approaches. Some focused on aligning with our judgments about rationality, others focused on matching our track record of being right. And it seems like there isn't a single easy answer to the puzzle of higher order evidence.
It's a complicated philosophical landscape.
And this has led some philosophers to think that maybe the conflict is just inherent. Maybe there are genuine epistemic dilemmas, or maybe we need to evaluate our beliefs in these situations using different standards.
Epistemic dilemmas, so situations where rationality itself pulls us in multiple directions that we can't fully satisfy.
Yeah, that's one way to think about it. Christensen, for example, argues that in cases like Aisha's, rationality might require her to both believe what her evidence seems to entail and to doubt that very belief due to the higher order worry. He suggests there might not be a perfectly rational response, but maybe the best she can do is find a kind of compromise, like reducing her confidence.
So maybe being perfectly rational is sometimes impossible when we have higher order concern.
That's the thought. Others have suggested that we need different standards for evaluating perfect, ideal reasoners versus us, flawed humans. De Paulo, for example, argues that while ideal agents might be able to just ignore higher order evidence, we non-ideal agents should pay attention to it because we know we're prone to making mistakes. And then Schechter offers a different perspective, saying that our imperfections might actually limit our responsibility to respond to higher order evidence.
So what's rational for a perfect being might not be what's rational for us messy humans.
Exactly. And then there's Schoenfield, who introduces this idea of best plans to follow versus best plans to make. He suggested the best plan to make, considering all our likely errors and limitations, might involve revising our beliefs based on higher order evidence, even though the best plan to follow, assuming perfect reasoning, might be to stick with our initial conclusions. This can explain why revising our beliefs in light of higher order doubt seems like a good strategy for us fallible creatures.
Right. We have to plan for our own weaknesses.
Yeah. And there are other perspectives to consider as well. Some philosophers distinguish between having reasons for a belief and it being rational to hold that belief. Others focus on the difference between being responsive to evidence and having internally coherent beliefs. And yet others emphasize the distinction between evaluating our specific responses to evidence and evaluating our overall dispositions to form beliefs in certain ways. They might argue that even if Aisha's belief about the fuel is based on good reasons, the hypoxia might make her overall belief-forming disposition unreliable. And finally, there's the distinction between having good reasons to believe something and actually being justified in believing it. So even if Aisha has good reasons to believe she has enough fuel, the hypoxia might undermine her justification for holding that belief with high confidence.
Wow, there are so many different ways to think about this. It's a really rich and complex area of philosophy.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack, and there's no easy one-size-fits-all answer.
So as we start to wrap up, what are the key things we should take away from this exploration of higher order evidence?
I think the most important takeaway is that higher order evidence forces us to really grapple with the relationship between our evidence about the world and our evidence about ourselves as thinkers.
It's like a meta level of thinking where we're thinking about our own thinking.
Exactly. And there are two big questions that keep coming up. First, is the significance of higher order evidence primarily about its implications for our rationality, for the coherence and justification of our beliefs? Or is it mainly about its implications for our reliability, for our track record of being right?
So is it about being internally consistent or about being accurate?
Exactly. And second, is it always irrational to be in a state of epistemic acrasia, believing something while thinking you shouldn't? Or are there situations where this kind of split is actually the best we can do given our limitations?
So how bad is it to hold beliefs we think we shouldn't?
These are tough questions, and there's no easy answer. But figuring out how to deal with higher order evidence is crucial for understanding what it means to be a good thinker, how we can best navigate the world with our imperfect minds, and ultimately, what it means to have knowledge.
It's been a really thought-provoking conversation. It really makes you think about all the times you second-guess yourself and how you handle those doubts. So, for all of you listening out there, here's something to ponder. Think about a time when you doubted your own judgment about something. How did you end up adjusting your beliefs? Did you put more weight on the initial evidence you had gathered or on your concerns about your ability to interpret that evidence correctly? And what does that experience tell you about the balance between trusting your own mind and recognizing its limits?
It's a good question to reflect on.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of high order evidence. We'll see you next time.